I'm Eric Schilling, and I'm here to talk about AMP Studio. AMP Studio is a new way to work where you can work totally in the cloud on your computer through a browser. So you don't need to own a piece of software. You don't need a specific piece of hardware. You just need a computer with a way to go on the web, and you can compile loops, write songs, sing into the software. And if you're not completely done, you close your computer, you go home, and the next day you can go to a different computer, pull it up on your browser in that one, and go right back to where you were. What I like about that is, in my world, I do a lot of traveling, and in the 60s and the 70s, and the time period that I started in, when you would record something, it was like you made an appointment to go do it. You had to book studio time. You had to make sure that all the people who were going to play on it, because they had to all play at the same time, could get there on the same day at the same time. And they all had to play it at once. And so it didn't allow you to start and stop in a simple way. And what's changed with this is it allows me to start on a song, get it to a certain point, close it, and if I think in the next day or two I hear an idea for a part, or I want to put a vocal on the song and I'm not at home, I'm somewhere else, say I'm at work or at a friend's house, I can go to his computer, pull open a browser and go back to AMP Studio, pull up the song I was on and continue to add parts to it, save it, and that work is all saved in the cloud. Then I can go home that night and bring up the song again and hear it again. That's a very different way to work. It's a new what I call a workflow. And in my mind, a lot of the way that we work now today is in pieces and in a more spontaneous way. And from where I started in my career, this is a huge move from where things were done in the 70s. So what I want to do before I start to talk about the software itself is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on me. And as I talk about me, I'm going to go through all of the tech changes I've seen through the years. I started in sound at the age of 15 in broadcasting, but not what you would think of as like news and that kind of stuff. I started at a place where we went and did a lot of live stuff from clubs. So in my youth, I worked with jazz stuff and classical stuff and rock stuff. So I could go from working with Miles on a jazz performance to something like Taj Mahal, to Randy Newman, to Peter Frampton, all over the map. And that was really fun part of my youth, and I really got the bug for doing what I do today, which is I mix for bands and I mix broadcast and done a lot of records throughout my life. So this is where I started. At the age of 20, I was really fortunate to have two things occur to me. I met a guy who was an old Motown guy who had done, worked with the Four Tops, the Supremes, with Marvin Gaye, with all the big people from Motown, and he was the person that taught me. So I got a lot of grounding in where stuff had come from and how people used to record then. So that same year, because of what he taught me, I landed a job at a big studio in Northern California called the Record Plant. And when I first came through the door, what all folks do, I got food, I made coffee, but in a pretty short amount of time, I got to start to work in the control room in a role that we called then a tape op, which does not exist anymore, where I ran the tape machine all day as the band would sing and record, and the person behind the board would mix the sound. And my very first client, when I walked through the door, I'll still recall this. I'd met the staff, they were going to hire me, and I come home from a party one night at 1 a.m. and I get the call, "Can you come over to the studio now? Sly Stone is at work and everybody's tired and we need to change shifts. We'd like you to come and work with Sly Stone." So for those of you who maybe don't know that name, Sly Stone really started the pop kind of funk thing. If you listen to Prince, if you're a fan of Prince, Prince is kind of is where the Sly Stone sound went to a more newer sound. So that was a great experience to work with Sly Stone. We had Fleetwood Mac in the time doing the Rumors LP, which I sat in for 3 weeks and worked with them and watched them write and sing and cut tracks. Same time we had Little Feat in, which is a band, it's not as popular today, but back then was really a groundbreaking band. So this is what I exposed to when I was 20. And at the end of that year, we had a producer come in who'd worked for the Eagles. They were building a studio across the country, and they asked me if I would like to move and take a job for their new studio that they had planned to build. And I, being the age I was, and I really liked what he did, I jumped at the chance. I put everything in the van. I drove 3,000 miles and moved across the country to work for him. And in that time period, he was doing the Eagles, he did Joe Walsh, he did The Who. So it was really, he was like the mecca of rock at that time. It's a great experience for me to learn and watch how those bands worked. And it also allowed me a chance to begin to sit behind the board, not just run the tape machine, but find my own sound, take what I'd learned from the times I'd watched folks and incorporate it into my own style. So in those years, one of the acts I met that I developed a tie to was Gloria Estefan. And she was, by the time I met her, I was 27 and she was 26. She was not very well known at the time. And I had a chance to work with her and to mix her first stuff. And this really formed a lifelong working tie between us. We've worked for years on all kinds of stuff. And I watched her career go from something small to a really world-known name. And that was a great experience to see somebody build their career and how they develop and change the way they work. So in the same years that I met Gloria and began to work with her at the start of her career, at the same time, I'm doing a David Bowie thing. He'd come to work at the place I worked. He was working with a band at the time called Tin Machine. And that was pretty fascinating to watch him walk in the room with a sketch. He had a track, and he would sit down on the floor and write the words to the song and start recording them right as he were able to record. So I worked with David Bowie at the time and Gloria, which is two ends of the spectrum, which was great to be able to go between a rock thing and a straight-ahead pop thing. And then in that same year, I was started on a Natalie Cole album. So now I've got the whole thing of like sort of old school pop, and Gloria at this time was new school pop, a lot of drum machines, a lot of sequence stuff, and then a Bowie who's sitting on the floor and he writes songs right in front of me. So it was a great time in my career. This all went on from the age of 27 for me through like 38, was all this stuff was transpiring. So then I get into the 90s. And now things are changing, and now there's the whole grunge thing and rock, and then there's the boy band stuff and the pop stuff. And I began working a little bit with the guy who'd formed a lot of the boy bands, who'd done NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys, that group, people who'd created them. So I was a little bit in the boy band world. But at the same time, I still had my foot in pop and rock, and started working with an act who's still known today, Shakira. And once again, I had the chance to start with somebody at the beginning of their career when they were just beginning to break, and to watch them go from sitting on the floor playing guitar and developing their sound to get to the point of being a worldwide name. So one thing that I noticed along the way when I met these people in my career was I seem to have a knack for working with female singers. I kind of knew their cadences and how to get performances from them. And I started to get demand from these acts like Gloria or Shakira or Natalie Cole would want me to come and work with them because I knew how to get voice performances from them and to make them comfortable. And there's just a certain way you need to approach people, especially when they're singing. And not sure why I have that skill, but it's just, I've always been really good at reading folks and kind of knowing when they're on the verge of a great performance. So I became very in demand in that time, and also because I could do lots of styles. And I always felt, I always have this saying, which I say to folks all the time. They ask me what I like in terms of style, and I can't tell you there's one thing I like. For me, it just needs to be good. I'm not really locked into style, which I think has worked well for me. So as the 2000s started, I kind of got back into where I started my career, which is doing broadcasts, but in a different way. I started doing award shows along with my record production work. And what was fun about doing award shows, if you sit down and watch a Grammy show, which is a show I've done for 10 years now, it's very eclectic. There again, I like all types of stuff. So I can go from doing a Bruno Mars to an Adele to the Weeknd to Hoosier, all kinds of stuff. And that part of my career has really blossomed in the last 10 years or so. As I said, what I like about it is I work on all kinds of styles. The work is, it goes by quickly, and you have to learn to work with the acts and get what they're trying to do pretty quickly. And you got to mix it live. And you have to know that when it goes out to the world, there may be 30 million folks that are going to sit and watch the show. And so you've got to get it right the first time that you do it. So throughout my career, one of the things that'll happen to you in career is when you get your first gold disc is always like, I remember when I got my first one, it was a really big deal for me. It was for a Gloria thing I'd done. And the gold disc had come in and they played a joke on me. It was right here in the same place we are today. They brought him in and they had the gold disc for her and for the guy that produced the album and people that played on it, and I didn't have one. And they basically said, oh, I think they forgot. We didn't get you one. And so I'm feeling a little bit blue about it. And then Gloria kind of goes behind the console, pulls it out, and brings out my gold album for me. I think I'm 30 at the time. And your first one is really, the first time you get a gold disc is really a big deal. And a similar experience is the first time I got a Grammy Award for a project I had done. I always say that's the best one because you've never had it before, and it's a big marker for your career. So in my career, I've gotten 4 of those awards of the Grammys, and I've gotten 16 of the Latin Grammys. And then for my broadcast work, I've gotten 5 awards for my broadcast work. So I've been very blessed that's occurred, and that all. I always like to explain to folks that sometimes you have to work a while before that stuff comes. It doesn't come that fast, but when it comes, you know that you've worked towards it, and it makes the work you've done mean. It makes those 10 years or 12 years you spent trying to get that point mean a lot more. Yeah, one could say it validates you. You don't do the work for the awards, but it certainly feels nice when people think that you do good work. It means a lot. So as I was saying before, when I do award shows, what I like is I do all types of stuff. One of my favorite things I've done in an award show was Pink. We had a performance one year where she was suspended from the ceiling and sang almost the whole piece being suspended by ropes in the ceiling. Those really stick with you. So as you can see, I've started my career in a pretty small way in broadcasting, gradually worked my way up through big studios to doing big acts and broadcasts. And the main thing is it's still fun for me. Okay, so I've given you a little bit of history about where I came from and how I started. What I didn't say was the stuff that has changed in terms of how we record and the tech stuff that we use today compared to where I first started my first job. The one thing I'll say about me is I may look like an old school guy, and I am to an extent, but I love new stuff. And the tools have changed a lot. When I started, I worked on a tube console, tube tape machines, old school microphones. And it was fun, but you can only do certain things with those tools. And this is 71. So it's the best that was available at the time. In short time, we went from 8 channels to be able to record on to 24. And suddenly in production, you could layer parts more, add more things. Consoles got a little more big from being a 16 fader board to being a 32, which oddly now seemed to me like a really big thing at the time. And in the 70s, in the last part of that decade is when you first started seeing things like pitch change devices that worked on digital stuff, or digital delays, or flangers. This was all brand new technology. It was expensive. And stuff that we just can throw on a piece of software today and use as a plug-in was a really big deal at the time. So that was just starting. The second big thing that occurred around the end of that time was the first drum machine. My friend went out and bought what we called a Linn drum machine, which was the first commercially made drum machine. It was called a Linn 1. It was 8-bit sounds. It was push buttons on a keyboard, on like a surface. You had a kick and snare. You couldn't change sounds. There was one kick sound, one snare sound, hi-hat. But it was changing the world of how we do production. So not long, like a year or two after we had the first drum machines, there was a device called the sampling keyboard. First folks to make it was Fairlight. And one of the first things it was used on was the Yes song, The Owner of a Lonely Heart. And I still recall being at work with my friends, and the song comes out and we play it, and if you've all heard it or go back and play it, you'll recall in the center of that song is a big breakdown, which is a sample from a Buddy Rich song. Big drum break, horn blast, really changed our whole way of thinking, and we all said we got to go out and get some of this stuff so we can start to program and work this way. So by now it's the 80s, and drum machines are starting to get used a lot more. We're starting to program the basis of songs. We're sampling sounds. We have synthesizers like Prophets. And at the same time, in my world, I'm beginning to move from a analog tape machine to a digital tape machine. And the first one I ever used was a 32-track tape machine, and there was no tape noise. And no matter how many times I played the tape, it always sounded the same, which was not true of the analog world, where the more you played the tape, the more it kind of wore out. And at the end of that decade is when you got into hard disk work, where you could record a sound to a computer system that recorded it to a hard drive. And with 2 of my partners, we went out and bought one of the first hard disk systems that was here. It was a lot of money. It was 2 channels in and 8 out. You could take the structure of a song and be halfway through the song and say, you know what? I think that we should move the bridge to after the second chorus as opposed to after the first chorus. So you could shift the way you structured a song all the way throughout the process. So it created new ways to think and new ways to do production. So at the end of the 90s, we're at the point where we're still on boards which have EQ chips in them, mic preamps, so they're what we call a analog console. But we're recording into a digital hard disk system at that time. So the next phase of that was digital boards. And what that would allot you is that you could work on a song, get partway through or get a mix partway through and stop and go on to something else and come back to it and be right back where you were, because it was a computer board. It put everything right back to where it was by just saying, I want to recall the song. So really the last step in this chain to me is when hard disk systems became a combination of a mixer and a way to record. And the best part about that for me was, as a mixer, if I mix a song and I've done all the work to adjust the volumes of the vocals and the solos and where the horns are and so on, and I'm really happy with the mix, and the producer says, I love the song, but there again, I want to move that bridge to a new place, I can go into the computer screen, move a chunk of the song. It takes all of my mix work and just moves along with the song, so it's all one piece of work. So this has all occurred since 2000 on. Now, at the same time, my first hard disk system for 48 channels was 2 racks this high side by side. So it was like having a washer and a dryer that big. And it was expensive still. And when I was going to record that way, I had to move the gear in, took time to set it up. So what's changed from then until now is the systems are a lot more small, the computers are a lot faster. And that really gets to the end of my technical life with where I am today with Amp Studio. Because what they've done is taken it from being a way to write, compose, and mix songs on a computer system where I have to carry the software on the computer, I have to have my license for the software, I have to carry maybe a piece of hardware to record the microphones. It's still somewhat of a large box, so when I get a concept for a mix or a song, I've got to go back into wherever my system is and sit down and bring up that song and go back to work on it. Because it's cloud-based and the software lives up in the cloud, that's one way it can live. If I finish a song and I go home and the singer calls me and says, I'd really like to add a loop here, or let's try a Rhodes part there. As long as I have a computer screen that gets onto the web, I can bring the song up. I don't have to carry anything home with me to do that. It's a very spontaneous way to work. And this provides a way to do that, and your stuff sits in a cloud. I'll state what I said at the front. One might take a look at me and go, I started in a certain time period with tape and tubes, and I'm an old school guy. And I am, to an extent, but I also love new ways to do things. And I always say to folks that it's really about the workflow and what tools you have to make your workflow work. So one other thing I really didn't talk about Amp Studio a lot was the fact that it's a hybrid piece of software. So what do I mean by that? And some of the traditional stuff I've used in the past 10 or 15 years software, you install the program on your computer, you have a license key, and you generally have a piece of hardware that goes to speakers. What Amp Studio does is it's a hybrid, which means 2 things. When I'm at home on my own system, I can download a native version of the software where the software is on my computer. And I still work from the cloud in the sense that the loops come from the cloud. The stuff that I record, if it's voice tracks or basses or however, will go back in the cloud and get stored in the cloud. But the piece of software lives on my, in this case, my Mac. What that affords me is I can use VST stuff on that. And certain things I couldn't, a couple things I can't do in the cloud. Part two of that is if I'm traveling or going to someone's house who I work with on a song, I don't have to bring my laptop with me or my license keys or any of those things. I go to his house and I pull the program up on a browser on his PC at his house. So the software and the sounds, it's all coming from the cloud. It's what we'd call a web app. There's no other software that I work with that does that. And in my modern scheme of life, and I think it's true for a lot of folks, here's a great way I would describe it. I started to work on a mix the first part of June. And then I went to Paris for a Shakira show. And the song wasn't quite done. So in my room, hotel room, I pulled up the song in a browser on a different computer that they had in the room. And I did some work on the song that she asked me to do. There's no other platform that I can do that on. So in that sense, it's a real hybrid of native and web-based application.